Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jody Allen, and I am the Robert Francis Ings Director of the Lemon Project, A Journey of Reconciliation. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our workshop this afternoon that will be led by Dr. Catherine Meeks, our keynote speaker from last night. But before we get to that, I want to share two statements with you. William and Mary acknowledges the indigenous peoples who are the original inhabitants of the lands our campus is on today. The Cherenhaka, Nottoway, Chickahominy, Eastern Chickahominy, Mattaponi, Monacan, Nansemond, Nottoway, Pamunkey, Potomac, Upper Mattaponi, and Rappahannock tribes, and pay our respect to their tribal members, past and present. Also, the Lemon Project stands with the rest of William and Mary in solidarity with our Asian, Pacific Islander, Middle Eastern, Southwest Asian colleagues and students to say that anti-Asian hate is unacceptable and has no place at William and Mary. It's my pleasure once again to introduce you to Dr. Catherine Meeks, who will be leading our workshop this afternoon. Dr. Meeks is the founding executive director of the Absalom Jones Episcopal Center for Racial Healing, as well as a retired Clara Carter Acree Distinguished Professor of Sociocultural Studies and Sociology from Wesleyan College. Catherine is an author who has published 7 books, including her recently co-authored book, Passionate for Justice, Ida B. Wells, A Prophet for Our Times, which was released in September 2019, and her edited book, Living into God's Dream, Dismantling Racism in America, which focuses on racial healing and reconciliation, which was published in 2016. She is a regular contributor to Hospitality, which is published monthly by the Open Door community. She is involved with prison work and faithfully visits a person who was formerly on death row. She is committed to working for the abolition of the death penalty, writing and helping to create spaces where transformation and rebirth can occur. I turn it over to you, Dr. Meeks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Allen. And it's good to be with you all again this afternoon. I don't know, I see a couple of faces that I've recognized from last night, or actually more than a couple. And I'm glad to have you back for this afternoon. And I don't know how many people are who were not here last night or here today, but today's time together builds on the things I said last night in terms of the whole notion of African-American women and self-invention. It's such a powerful notion to think about, and it's borne out throughout our understanding of African-American women in history. We see so much of the achievement, accomplishments that we have done, and realize that we've done it in spite of great odds and many times without much systemic support. And so the 3 women that I want to talk about today really are part of my cloud of witnesses. And last night someone said something about my communion of saints. And so what I want to do before I get started is to ask you to be thinking about who makes up your cloud of witnesses, because I want to talk a bit about these 3 women, and then I want us to talk together about the whole subject. So think about who makes up your cloud of witnesses, and number 1. And number 2, think about a time when you were confronted with something and it required you to give birth to a new part of yourself, to a part of yourself that you didn't know existed, but you found yourself rising to the occasion and actually dealing with the issue. And as you look back in retrospect, perhaps you might even be a bit surprised at the way you managed to do that. So who makes up your cloud of witnesses? And then what wasn't a time in your own journey that you got challenged to reinvent yourself, or to invent yourself, or to let a part of yourself be birth that you didn't know was possible. So just kind of be not so focused on it, but focused on it enough so that when I get through talking, you won't have to think too hard to be ready to engage in a conversation about this. I want to start with Ida B. Wells, because Ida B. Wells is the oldest of the three women that I want to talk about. Ida B. was born in 1862, and you see this, I have this picture of her as a young girl on my bedroom wall, on my office wall, and I have pictures of her as an older woman all around in my house, because she is so absolutely important to me. She was born in Holly Springs, Mississippi. Her parents died when she was 16 in the yellow fever epidemic that occurred. They died within 24 hours of each other, which is hard to imagine, losing your parents, in both parents, that quickly. And so she heard people, family members and people she overheard them, because they weren't really talking to her, because she was a 16-year-old, about talking about splitting up the kids. There were 5 kids, and one of them was actually had some kind of disability. They were talking about splitting up the kids and parceling them out to folks who could take them, because nobody could take 5 kids. And so Ida B said, my parents will turn over in their grave if they heard this conversation, and if they thought that this is what would happen to us. And so, no, you're not going to do that. Now, she's 16 years old. Just remember that. She's 16 years old, and she takes on the responsibility of her siblings. She put her hair up on her head, like in the first picture we saw, with the hair piled on her head, so she'd look older, and managed to find herself a teaching job. And then one of her cousins, she engaged a cousin to help her. So the cousin stayed with the kids during the week, and she went off to teach. And on the weekends, she would come home and help cook and wash and do all the stuff you needed to do to keep everything going, and then go back to teach. Whenever I think of this and talk about it, I think that in itself would have been, like, if we didn't hear much more about her for ever and ever, that would be an amazing thing, that she actually took on that kind of had that kind of sense of agency, that she could take on the caretaking of these young people. She loved learning, but wasn't able to go to school that much because of the circumstances of her life. Her father was an activist, and she it seemed to follow in his footsteps in many, many ways. I don't know what you know about Ida B. Before I get too far and before I forget, I want to show you the book that her great granddaughter has written, which is called Ida B. The Queen, which has just come out. And it's a wonderful book that I would think you would enjoy having it to go to read, but also to just have it to thumb through, because it's got amazing artwork as well as photographs in it, and a wonderful way that Michelle Duster, her great granddaughter, has laid the book out. So I recommend it highly. And I was looking to show you a copy of my book, Passionate for Justice. And this is pretty pitiful for the author not to have any copies of her own book in her house. So I guess I keep giving them away. So I'm going to have to make sure I'll get copies of it. But Passionate for Justice was I co-wrote that with Reverend Nib Stroop, and we try to use that book to talk about how Ida B. is a prophet for our time. And I truly think that she is absolutely that. A couple of other highlights about her, and the next biggest thing that I guess I could talk about is her being thrown off of a train because she had bought a ticket, and they gave her first class ticket, a ticket to sit in the ladies' car. And of course, remember, we talked about Black women not being seen as ladies, and she certainly wasn't supposed to be sitting in the ladies' car. She was supposed to be wherever was supposed to be her place, which was back with away from there and where people were smoking and all that. So when the ticket person came by to take up the tickets, he tried to get her to move, and she had the ticket, and she said absolutely not. And so then he decided at the next stop he was going to throw her off the train, and she actually fought with him and bit the guy. I mean, she was determined that they weren't going to throw her off the train, but they managed to do it. It took a couple of them to do it. And then she sued the railroad company and won the lawsuit, but then lost an appeal because of some lawyers who didn't do right by her. And but here she's still a young woman, and she was traveling back and forth to teach when this incident happened. This kind of struggle against the system is very consistent with her life, because later on, when she had an office, a newspaper office in Memphis, Tennessee, and had begun to work on lynching. And really, she was one of the major voices against, maybe she was the major voice, I should say, working against lynching. The white people were so distressed at her because her analysis of lynching was this. The story that was being told was that all these Black men were doing all these horrible things to white women, and so that they deserved to be lynched. And Ida B was telling the truth about the lies that were being told. In the present moment, we talk about white women who say bad things about Black people, and particularly Black men. We're calling them Karens. There were a lot of those in her era who were making claims against Black men, causing them to be lynched. And Ida B told that story and said, no, we're not doing all these things. This is happening to us because of the system that is trying to make sure that we are terrorized and will stay in our place. And so because of that, the FBI investigated her. There was a bounty put on her head. They burned down her newspaper office in Memphis, and she left and moved to Chicago and didn't come back to the South for many years. She did come back to the South in disguise about 30 years later, when a group of men had been arrested in Elaine, Arkansas, which happens to be not very far from where I grew up. And she went to visit them under the cover of, she disguised herself, but she did go to visit them because she wanted to tell them to stop accepting that they were just going to be executed. And it ended up ultimately that they did not get executed. So I think that her coming to help to get them to stand up a little taller and to fight a little harder was a good thing for them. I think what you can see through this whole thing is a woman with a bunch of courage and capacity to just do the next thing that makes sense to her. Now, I do have to say very quickly, it's easy for us to want to put people like Ida B. Wells on a pedestal. We want to make them into, somebody larger than life, and therefore we don't have to be challenged by their courage and their way of being in the world, because they're such extraordinary people, and extraordinary people do extraordinary things. And if I want to then deem myself not being extraordinary, that means I get to just kind of limp along. Ida B would make a serious case for herself not being extraordinary. And one of the most delightful things I had was reading her Memphis diary and reading about her as a young woman who, was upset because there's some guy she liked that didn't like her. And she'd be saying, I don't know what's the matter with them. They're just not very honorable, And then she loved clothes, and I can relate to that, but she was always shopping beyond her means. And so she was broke a lot, and I can relate to that too, So I love the way she was humanized in her Memphis diary. And that's so important to see that side of her, that very human side, that part of her that was making messes. And even when she was quite involved in the women's suffrage movement, worked a lot with Susan B. Anthony. Susan B. Anthony was less than nice to her, even though Anthony was actually fired her secretary because the secretary didn't want to do work for Ida B because Ida B was Black. So Susan B. Anthony made that big effort, but then she didn't really know who Ida B was and didn't really have much of a capacity to really connect to her the way somebody ought to connect to another human being. When Ida B got married and had her first child, Susan B. Anthony kept snapping at her every time she would say something. And finally, Ida B. confronted her and said, "Why are you talking to me like this? Every time you say my name, I hear this bite in it." And Susan B. Anthony's response was that she had divided duty now that she was married, because you couldn't be an activist and a mother and a wife. And who is Susan B. Anthony to have anything to say about that, is my response as I read this. And it just speaks to Susan B. Anthony's lack of understanding who Ida B. was. Susan B. Anthony was able to be single and be an activist because she had a great support community. Ida B. says she had nobody to support her. And she's out there trying to be an activist for Black rights and women's rights, and having people wanting to kill her. And she didn't really have a community. She didn't have ladyhood, maleness, and whiteness. Anthony had whiteness and ladyhood to fall back upon. And Anthony did not have, Wells did not have that. And Wells got married to Ferdinand Barnett, who was a lawyer. And here's Anthony not getting that at all. So that's a very important thing for you to remember, particularly when we think about white women saying to Black women, "Oh, it's all about sisterhood and we're all in this together and everything's the same for all of us." It's so far from the truth, because it's the where we are as Black women is in this double consciousness, this double bind of being women and being Black and having to figure out, as Du Bois says, this two-ness and sometimes three-ness. That's not the case for white women. So Susan B. Anthony and Ida B. Wells have they make a good statement about that part of the struggle between Black women and white women. I'll tell you one more story about the suffragists. They were going to be having a march, and they didn't want the Black women to be in it because they thought that white women would be disturbed if Black women were marching with them, but Southern white women wouldn't want Black women marching with them, because you see here again, racism was stronger than sisterhood. So Ida B. just let them talk. And then when the march came by her, where she was standing, she just stepped into the line and just went right on marching as if they had invited her to come and be there. That was her way of being in the world, that whatever she needed to do, she just stepped into it and did it. And so I just can't tell you how much I love this woman. I just can't tell you how important she is in terms of just holding up the possibilities for self-invention, the possibilities for listening to yourself and putting your foot forward when you don't know for sure if there's ground in front of you, but you think it might be because the last time you put your foot down, you found the ground. Talk about walking by faith. She doesn't talk a whole lot about faith, but there is no reason for her to talk about it, because her life is an absolute example of somebody who's walking by faith. Her work with lynching was just phenomenal. And can you believe that it's taken until, I think, 2 years ago, actually, for a bill to come to Congress saying that lynching is a hate crime, that lynching is something we need to be disturbed about, And then just recently, this Texas representative that talked about justice being, justice used to be when you just throw a rope over a tree and lynch somebody. To think about an elected official making a comment like that, and to think about that we took all these years to finally say lynching is something we don't want to do in this country. And the fact of the matter is, it took us so long because it is not something we don't want to do. There are folks who do want to do it. And that's why ropes keep showing up everywhere. So Ida B. said that it was better to die fighting for having the opportunity to have an upright life than it was to be killed like a dog. And that was her attitude. Her attitude was that, she wasn't gonna say yes to oppression. She wasn't gonna say yes to hatred and to opportunities to silence her, or to efforts for the efforts to silence her. She wrote amazing things and all of many, many books, and you can go and look them up if you want to get deeper into thinking about her. I do think that her voice is a voice of an amazingly prophetic voice, and her great granddaughter Michelle Duster stands in her own right as an activist and scholar, but has done a lot to help her great grandmother's voice to be acknowledged. Their streets have been named after her. She just recently received a posthumous Pulitzer for her journalistic work on lynching, which is amazing. They would not have ever given that to a Black woman when she was alive in that era, but thank God that somebody got it done, even now that she's not here anymore. So since I've got two more women to talk about, I got to shut up about Ida B, but I could talk about her till next week, because that's just, she just is such a wonderful soul, down to earth woman. Sounds like somebody I would have been really glad to sit down with for a cup of tea, I think. And then, of course, she was born in 1862, and then Mary McCleod Bethune was born in 1875. So Ida B was 13 years old when Mary McCleod Bethune was born, and you can see these very lovely pictures of her and the look of determination and I'm here to stay. Intizaki's Shange's name means she who comes with her own things. These women came with their own things, even though the culture didn't know what they were, and um, and didn't recognize it and didn't honor it. They knew they had something, and they kept looking and refusing to let other people define them. I think that's the best way to characterize them. Thank you, Sarah. So Mary McCleod Bethune was born as Mary Jane McCleod, and she was the daughter of former slaves. She was an educator. She worked for civil rights and women's rights. She worked with government officials. She is famous for her work in education. She was one of 17 children. She was the last of the 17 children that her parents, Samuel and Patsy, had. And I think you would probably know, even if you don't know a lot about her, you would probably have heard of Bethune-Cookman College in Florida, which started out, of course, not as a college, but as a small school. She again, the she had in common with Ida B a thirst for education, and so did my mother. I mean, all of these people had this kind of, almost an inordinate thirst for education, and if they couldn't get it for themselves, they then tried to make sure that other people had access. She graduated from a seminary in 1894 called Scotia Seminary in North Carolina, and then she went on to work to attend the Dwight Moody Institute for Home and Foreign Missions in Chicago, but nobody was willing to sponsor her. She couldn't find a church to sponsor her, so she decided to forget trying to be a missionary and became an educator. And thank God for that, because there were so many young people that weren't able to get education, and to have somebody become an advocate for that and to lobby for them was a good thing. She married a former, one of her colleagues, a fellow teacher, and they moved to Florida and worked there. And she also sold insurance. So again, here's the willingness to invent yourself, to do what you got to do to survive, to do what you've got to do to go on down the road you need to go down. She was divorced in 1904 and had a son. And so that's part of why she started selling insurance, because she needed to, she was divorced and she needed to have more income. And as I just said, she started first, she started a training school for girls, and then she merged with the Cookman School for boys, and that's how we ended up with Bethune-Cookman. And Bethune-Cookman College issued its first degree in 1943. How about that? From this woman who was the daughter of people who've been held in slavery, this woman who was poor, this woman who liked to brag about she started the school with $2.34 in her pocket. Well, she had no money, but she had a lot of friends, and her friends were people who helped her get the school going. She was a person who was quite an activist. She worked with the National Council of Negro Women, and then was the founding president of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, and that eventually morphed into there being a council of Negro women that she was the founding president for. She did a lot of work on helping people who were Republicans, which was the party of Lincoln in her day, to move from that to being Democratic during the Great Depression. She was a close friend of Eleanor Roosevelt's, and Franklin Roosevelt appointed her to be, and I'm just going to read this so I'll get it right. She was the highest ranking African-American woman in government when Roosevelt appointed her as Director of Negro Affairs for the National Youth Administration. Here's this woman, again, putting one foot in front of the other, doing what needs to be done and reaching out and not assuming that there were any limitations that she had to honor. She was appointed by Harry Truman in 1945 to do some work with the United Nations as the United Nations was getting started. And when they had their initial conference, she was the only woman of color at that conference. And here again is something just so important to note, that when these women got a seat at any table, they brought other people with them. And of course, the National Association of Negro Women's Clubs had the motto, lifting as we climb. So we don't climb by ourselves. We make sure that others, if there's space that's made for us, we make sure that other people who didn't get access have access now because we're there. And when people don't have that attitude, it's incredibly disturbing, because that is what oppressed people need to never allow themselves to lose sight of the fact that we need to bring others with us as the doors open for us to go in a door, instead of kind of sitting there as if we have some high privilege because we got to be at the table. Being at the table by yourself is a lonely spot to be in the first place. Bethune was like Ida B. in writing for newspapers. She wrote for the Pittsburgh Courier and the Chicago Defender. And as a writer and as a person who knows how important words are and language, and I think it's real important for people who are who have a mission to open up doors and open up systems or to change systems, to write about it, because that's one of the ways you can get the word out about what you're trying to do and who you are, and how you how you think things ought to be. There is a postage stamp that was put out in 1985 to honor Mary McCleod Bethune, and her home is a National Historic Site now. So this brings me then to my mom. And I have to say that I didn't always understand who she was. I didn't understand that for a while in my life, and I'm so thankful to have had some awakening. I probably have some pictures somewhere that don't have tape on them, but I couldn't find them this morning, so I sent this picture to Sarah. Malissa Alberta Jackson Meeks was born in 1912 in Junction City, Arkansas. I know you know just right where that is when you hear me say it, right? So little town, the wide spot in the road. Thank you, Sarah. A wide spot in the road between Arkansas and Louisiana. If you half of Junction City is in Arkansas and the other half is in Louisiana, and the whole thing's not bigger than, you could drive through it in like a half a minute and get in one side and be out of the other. My mother was a washerwoman. She and my aunt had many washerwomen stories to tell us. I mean, washerwomen with the rub board and the wash pot and the the zinc tub and all of that stuff. As I was growing up, for a long time, I actually had the rubboard that one of my aunts had. So I have my own roots are in the washerwoman culture as well, because that was one of the jobs you could pretty well count on getting if you were a Black woman in a community somewhere. Mama was also a teacher. My mother graduated from college from college the same year that I graduated from high school. So my mother went to college for 18 years. And the reason why she went to college for 18 years was not because she was a slow learner, but because there were just at the school, there wasn't access. You know, she lived in Junction City. The closest college was in Pine Bluff or Little Rock. And so she went there, which was like Little Rock was about 110 miles and Pine Bluff was over 100 miles from where she lived. So she went to school, she went to those schools. She went to actually Philander Smith College in Little Rock. And they had what we would call now distance learning. Then it was extension courses and correspondence courses. So you could actually get your lessons sent to you and you could do them and send them back. And you could do some of that work and then you could go to do the extension work where they brought the classes somewhere kind of close to you and you could go there. So I used to watch my mother work in the fields in the morning with my father, who was an illiterate sharecropper. And we had a field of cotton to work in. My mother would work there in the mornings and then come and get us together. It was all three of us, and I was the oldest, and put us in the car and drive to Forest City, which was about 30 miles from us, to take an extension class that Philander Smith offered. She did all of this stuff while she was teaching and being a farm woman and raising us. So like when I think back over this, you know, and say, how do you do this? How do you do this? How do you be Ida B. Wells? How do you be Mary McCleod Bethune? How do you be Melissa Jackson Meeks? How do you do that? And you don't do it by sitting around thinking about it. You do it by getting up every day and putting one foot in front of the other and going forward and letting yourself give birth to the energy and the will and the impetus to keep on going in spite of what's in front of you. The other day, somebody said to me, they were talking about a woman who worked for them, a Black woman who worked in their house, and nobody was, you know, the whole community was white. And this woman said, it took so much courage. Well, it may have taken courage, but what it took more of was an understanding about survival and taking care of the children that you had to take care of. So the understanding the responsibility and understanding your call to be that person to stand up to the task gave them courage. You know, they didn't sit around trying to see if, trying to scare themselves to death so they couldn't do what was in front of them. And I think that we have the luxury of doing that some in the 21st century. We can sit and scare ourselves out of action. And these women didn't do that. They didn't allow themselves to be scared out of action. They just looked at what was in front of them and said, here's the task and it's got to get done. Ida B. Wells at 16 saying, no, you don't split our family up like that. What 16-year-old thinks they can take care of 4 kids? You know, I don't want to take care of 4 kids, you know, but this business of looking at the situation and then listening to what the call is and having the faith and really the grit to think I can do something about that. And that's the thing that I think is so amazing about all these folks. My mama I would go in the kitchen and look around and say, there's nothing in here to eat. And what are we gonna do about a meal? And then about 2 or 3 hours later, my mother would put all this food out. She invented, you know, she was always an inventor. I mean, she always made a meal, and the meal was more than you could have ever have imagined. And then she would do that with, she'd take the sacks that we got the feed in for the pigs, and there were cloth sacks, and she would make clothes for us. And she could come up with a remedy for almost any illness that you showed up with. So she was really a folk medicine woman. Now, there was a time when I didn't appreciate the folk medicine part because I thought she was probably going to poison us one of these days with some of that stuff she was talking about we ought to do. And now, you know, I'm 75 now and I'm just like her, looking for my little bottle of oil for this or that or the other. You know, my friends who know me say, you know, I'm not going to go to the doctor unless I absolutely have to, because I can think of, I can do this and I can do that and I can do something else and I'll be okay. I learned that from my mother. I just didn't appreciate it back when I was a kid, because when I was a kid, I thought it was kind of weird. But, you know, she could think of, she had a remedy for any ailment that you came up with. And we didn't go to the doctor that much, actually. We went a little bit, but for many, many things, we didn't go to the doctor. Is that whole tradition in my mother's family with my aunt and my grandmother of that kind of folk medicine way of doing. I think my mother probably would have gone to med school or something if she'd had an opportunity, but for her getting a college degree was quite a challenge, and med school was certainly not an issue. I want to tell you one other little thing about her, and then I want to stop so we can talk together. She taught in a one-room schoolhouse, eight grades in a one-room schoolhouse, grades 1 through 8 in a one-room schoolhouse. And when I was born, she put a crib in that schoolroom and the kids helped take care of me. So I literally went to school all of my life, you know, because the crib was in the schoolhouse, the schoolroom, and she and the kids took care of me during the day while she taught. They wanted to have a lunchroom at their school. So my mother and her students built a lunchroom onto the room, the one room that they had, because my grandfather was a carpenter and my mother picked up some of that stuff from him. So they built cabinets and stuff and made themselves a lunchroom. My mother had taught me what I have characterized as a definition of tenacity. She lived her life. She never said this. I don't even know if she would have ever used the word tenacity, but she lived a tenacious life. In my way of working with words, I define tenacity by the behavior that I saw in my mother. And my definition of tenacity is that when you get to the end of your rope, you tie a knot and you hang on. That is tenacity. That you and my mother would say over and over to us, particularly when we were lamenting about something or trying to talk ourselves into going crazy, she'd say, tomorrow's another day. And I would kind of look at her like, yeah, so it is another day. So what does that mean? And her notion was that you don't know what tomorrow's going to bring. Tomorrow will open up a door, open up a window, open up an idea that you didn't have today that can change everything. So here are these three women. And of course, last night I talked about Miss McCarty, and there are hundreds of them. These stories are 4 stories out of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of stories. And that energy is alive and well in the 21st century. We just need to pay more attention to it. And I want to say, it's not just confined to African-American people. The energy of ingenuity and creativity and invention is energy in the universe, and people can engage in it to the extent that you're willing to. That is the beauty of living in the world and understanding that, you know, really and truly God's no respecter of persons. And that's why I get so sick and tired of the fact that we don't fix things better, because there's no reason for it. There is no excuse for us to have the world be in the mess it's in, because the capacity for healing and fixing things is out there if we would just be willing to step up to the plate and go for broke. And these people, Ida B., Mary McCleod Bethune, Malissa, Alberta Jackson Meeks, were willing to step up to the plate. And so when I think about them, I don't get to grumble. I told you that last night. I don't get to grumble. I can grumble for a little minute. I can have a little pity party for a minute, and then I have to send it on down the road to somebody else and get up and go do what I'm supposed to do. What Ida B said to those guys in Elaine that were in prison, kind of groveling around and lamenting and thinking they were going to be killed, she told them to get up and put your pants on and act like a man. That was her get up, put your pants on and act like you've got some resources, act like you know something. And, Sojourner Truth, I remember Sojourner Truth. I don't remember because I wasn't there, even though when I talk to little kids about all this stuff, they think I was a slave and I was back there with those people. But I recall reading about Sojourner Truth telling Frederick Douglass that when he was lamenting about the plight of African Americans, she questioned him about whether God was dead. And if God is dead, then all of what you're saying is really true. But if God is not dead, then maybe there's some reason to have hope. And so these people, these three people, hold up that banner by allowing themselves to be invented over and over and over, by becoming, none of them would have been able to tell you, to even imagine the life that we are now talking about. None of them. They don't know, they didn't know they had that life that was going to be being talked about all these years later. My mother would never, ever think that I would be somewhere in a symposium called the Lemon Project talking about her. She would never have thought that would happen, ever, because she didn't think about herself in that way. She just thought about herself getting up every day and doing what she needed to do. And I think Mary McCleod Bethune and Ida B. Wells and all of them were getting up every day and doing what they needed to do. So now I ask you, when we started, to think about a time when you had to allow a part of yourself to be invented, or to give birth to a part of yourself that you hadn't been so conversant with before. And I promised that this time together was going to not just be me talking. So I want you to be in this conversation with me, and also to think about who makes up your cloud of witnesses, because all of us have a cloud of witnesses, and it's real important to identify them, so we stop walking around thinking we're just in the universe on our own. We're in the world on our own trying to do stuff. We have got a cloud of witnesses. Even if you don't, I believe in angels, but I also believe that they're witnesses that were the ancestors, the people who were here, that have gone on, that are still caring about us and knowing what we're doing and trying to help us be who we were put on the earth to be. I believe that. And whether it's true or not, it works well for me. And so if you don't believe it, I'm not going to twist your arm, but I'm going to say it would be nice to believe in something other than just that you're in it all by yourself. Because if you think you're in this journey all by yourself, it's fairly frightening. So I think there's a small enough group here that we can just, you unmute yourself, and I see many cameras are not on, but if you are gonna speak, it would be nice if you turn on your camera so we can see you, unless you have a very good reason, like I would have had a few hours ago for not turning on my camera because I would have scared you to death. So who would like to begin sharing a little bit? Yes, Stephanie.
Yes. Thank you for sharing everything so far. I enjoyed last night as well as today. Um, my mother became ill, and she was living with my middle sister in Richmond. I live in Hampton. And my sister needed a break because this was around the clock, literally, with my mother, and she was developing dementia. And so I made a decision to make myself available, and at her call whenever she needed a break and she needed me to be there. And I had a friend who was in nursing, and I said, I don't know how in the world you nurse, because I could not do some of the things that nurses have to do. I just couldn't imagine that. And I did everything that needed to be done to help take care of her. And so that, brought another part of me out that I didn't think that I would be capable of doing.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you, Stephanie, for sharing.
It's funny. I have a similar story in terms of when I had to step up and do things that I didn't ever think, and actually that my mother didn't think I would ever be able to do. When I was a kid, my mom also, well, let me back up. My mother also developed Alzheimer's, and I knew that I was going to be the person to take care of her. But when I was a kid, like she would laugh sometimes when she says, because she was a nurse, and she said, "Oh, you'll never be a nurse." And I said, "No, never. I'll never do that." And but she remembered the time that my brothers and my dad were all sick at the same time with the flu.
Mm.
They were in different bathrooms throwing up, and I went to bed because I couldn't. I went to bed because I couldn't stand to hear it. I couldn't stand to be, and but and I hate sometimes that I couldn't laugh with her about this, because I would think while I was taking care of her, I would think, we never thought I would be able to do this ever. If you had told me, I would have lost the bet. But
Mhm.
like Stephanie is saying, when you have to, I learned about myself through that I can and will step up. And there are things that, because my mom always said, soap and water takes care of everything. And, and that was kind of my mantra in my head, or whatever it was I had to do. And I'm so thankful that those people that went before me, that were giving me that strength, I guess, as you're saying, Catherine,
Mhm.
that I was able to channel that.
Mhm. Yes, thank you, Jody.
Could I add one more thing? I don't want to take
Sure.
anybody else's time. I forgot to say that prior to my mother's illness, my sister-in-law had developed, was beginning to develop dementia, and she ended up being determined by the doctor that she actually had early onset Alzheimer's. So
Mm.
I really helped to take care of her for 2 years, and that was my sister-in-law. And she only had a son living with her. So there was no other female relative in my husband's family to help take care of her but me. So that
Mhm.
really prepared me for what I would later have to do for my mother.
Mhm. Yes, thank you. Yes.
I have, again, my group of angels that I actually kind of ran into by accident. I'm a Midwesterner. My husband was a Midwesterner, but he was an Air Force officer, and he got transferred to Langley. And at that point, we owned a home in Indiana where the unemployment rate in our county was 19%. And we couldn't sell our house, so we rented it. And I had to work because we needed a place to live here, but we also had a house payment to make in Indiana. And I had, in Indiana, I worked at one of the branches of Indiana University, and I finished my associate degree there. But I loved working in the education system. So we're in Hampton, Virginia, and there is this ad in the paper one Sunday for an administrative secretary at what was then Hampton Institute. And I ended up working at Hampton Institute for a year and a half in their assessment center. And I worked for a group of 8 women and 1 part-time man. And they are my angels in the cloud, because I had never been, and I was very frank in my interview. I said, I don't want to be the token. I'm not ready to be the only white person on the campus and in the office. And they assured me that I wasn't. They actually made an arrangement for me to meet a couple people in the building. But they were absolutely wonderful. This was 1983, and things were relatively quiet, but I learned so much about what African American at that point, students went through compared to the other I worked on a campus when I was in school full-time. You know, they were predominantly white student bodies, and the things they went through and how helpful this group of women, there were three especially, were to me when things might be misinterpreted, when things were, when the students were starting to get riled up and they were all out in Ogden Circle, which we could see from our office. One or two of them, always of these ladies, would call me in and say, now, do you know what's going on? And I go back to some of those things today. I did leave the campus and I eventually did some work in a criminal justice academy. And my assignment one year, it would have been 1994, in my annual review was to develop a 1 day, so we're talking 8 hours, diversity program for the basic law enforcement students. And I thought, why me? But it turned out to be the turning point in my life. I did this work with another woman who was actually a retired, she was one of the first African-American female police officers on the DC police force. And we are still just like this. But it made a change in my life. And I can't say that there was only one or two, it was a whole group of people.
Great. Cloud of witnesses. Yeah, thank you.
A big cloud. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie.
I'll go.
Hi.
Hi. I was abused by a family member for some years as a kid, and it felt like I was a secret keeper that needed to protect my parents and others around them. And I think in some really, well, as we kind of see in this world we live in, ways that others have also experienced. And when I eventually got to a spot where I don't really, well, when it felt like I could release those secrets, and it's particularly to my parents, and kind of really come into a spot where it felt like, yeah, I have this trauma in my body and in my soul and in my lineage that I would like to heal and release and feel like I don't have to, well, protect them because I'm just as important. That felt like such one of my most favorite moments of reinvention, to feel like I could break free of that and really just come into more of myself, because it was there, but it just felt like as time passed and I got to really just focus on my healing, as well as how my speaking my truth also does heal my family and others, that but yeah, I'm just really glad that I'm me and how I've evolved from those experiences.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that with us. I appreciate it. And I know you're not supposed to say personal things to people you don't know, but I absolutely love your hair. So
thank you so much. So happy to be here. Wonderful presentation again, to hear about your mom and story. It was so wonderful.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. I know there are probably a lot of introverts here, so it takes you a while for you to get the nerve to open your mouth. But I'm used to conducting workshops that are done in silence, so I will just sit here until you decide to speak. So
I'll share a bit.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson.
It's interesting because at noon I was thinking about who was my holy trinity. And three men came to mind: James Baldwin, Bayard Rustin, and Essex Hemphill. And they came to mind because I've been deeply studying the ways that Black same-gender loving men impact our communities and the ways that they have been historically involved in justice work. But throughout this week, I've just been really reflecting on the women in my life. And as you mentioned, this cloud of witnesses, of course, I'm thinking about my grandmothers, the women in my community who always had something positive to say. The candy woman, as we would call her, on the corner, who we could just rely on just for her wisdom. And always a place where you would go and you would just feel safe in that environment. My educators, my teachers, who gave me the courage, and one in particular, to even study African American history, and who nurtured my gift at a very, very young age. So I've just really enjoyed this week, and I've just taken it as a moment just to reflect on the different ways that Black women, ranging from those in my family and those who are just around me, impact my life on a daily basis.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. And the candy woman, I love that. Yeah. Yeah. There's Toni Morrison's book, Sula. I think there's a woman in there that a couple of women selling candy, and or the kids go, it's sort of like they are a magnet in the community in a way, and they've got these little things that they sell, but in addition to the selling of whatever the product is that amazing love and grace and gift of wisdom that they are departing. And people maybe go there more for that than they do the candy. They just don't even know that, So thank you for bringing the candy woman to this conversation.
I'll share. When my marriage ended, I think is the time that I felt like I had to become more of who I was called to be. And I can remember very strongly my aunt, my mother's sister, who had been widowed when she had 6 kids. The youngest, I think, was 2 or something at the time. And she, like fixed me with this stare kind of and said, "You can do this. You are strong and you will be able to get through this." And it meant the world to me. It was just that it felt like a kind of legacy of female strength. And also just, she had been there, so she knew what she was asking of me, kind of, and what kind of inner and outer resources would be required. And I just, I've thought of that many times since, that, her kind of charge to me that this is what you're going to do. And it made a big difference.
And in addition to the legacy, Lisa, it's also that somebody can see you better than you can see yourself. And affirm what they see. I remember that from as a kid in college, because I didn't see myself as being able to do things, but other people could see that possibility. I mean, I did a lot of stuff, but there were a lot of things I couldn't see that other people could see. And it gave me the courage to keep putting my foot down. And so, or helped me find the courage. And so it's really, that's why the cloud of witnesses matters so much, because people can affirm what you need to have affirmed, because they see it's there, and you don't always see it yourself. So people living in isolation have such a sad road to walk on, because they don't have that kind of somebody to put their hand on your shoulder, or to invite you onto their shoulders. We talked a little bit about standing on shoulders last night. We stand on so many shoulders. And so it's so good to pay attention to who they are, to who's there, Yeah. What about others of you? We still have a good many people here that I know everybody's got a story to tell, and everybody's got a person or something that somebody that an incident that's pushed you forward. So let's share and make this community a little bit richer that we have managed to call together for this afternoon.
I'll share just a quick addendum. I didn't make clear that it's the women in my family, are certainly the shoulders that I stand on. And I had, because I had watched my mother, I knew what I was going to do and wanted to do for my mother because I had watched her take care of her mother and her father, and so, and I knew of other women in my family who had taken care of people. And so, regardless of, they all insisted that I go to college and I get my book learning. But what I also learned from them was, again, as you say, they never said it like this, but that I was standing on their shoulders. And, but they were also my role models.
Absolutely. And they made education, for us to get our education, it was not negotiable.
Oh, no.
You had to do it because they knew that education was the way to liberation, and they didn't have it. They lived, many of them lived with that part of liberation not being open to them, but they were the thirst for education and the understanding of its value and its liberating capacity. My mother never had to say to me, education was important, because I watched her get her work to get her own degree. I mean, to think about my mama graduating, I graduated in May of 1964, and my mother graduated in August of 1964 from college. And so, was I going to go to college? Yes. And was I going to graduate? Yes. Or else I was going to die trying. That was the way that was going to be. I was either going to do it, and it was not easy, but that didn't have a thing to do with it. The thing that I had to do was every day be putting a foot in front of the other, working in that direction. So, and yes, somebody.
Yeah.
Hey, Cookie.
Hey, Kathy. So, I think of, along with, of course, my grandmother and mother, as others are talking about, I think about those wonderful women in church in San Diego, California, who were always there to support me. Though most of them were domestic workers, whenever there was an event at school and I was being honored or whatever, they would pool their monies together and purchase something for me that they thought I would enjoy. And I remember my going away party for college, where they came and purchased the ironing board, the typewriter, which was big then. So that shows you, right? And how wonderful, that feeling of community. They were so happy for me to be going to college and being able to do something that they had been unable to do. And then when I attended graduate school in Boston, there they were out there, around. This is when you could actually walk very close to the, airplane. And there was my community of women transferring me to another community of women in Boston, because as soon as I joined church in Boston, a very hungry graduate student, earning $36 a week on that, whatever that they call that program where you worked and received some monies. The sisters at church would take me home every Sunday, right, to feed me. They'd call me during the week. They'd make sure that I had car fare, to do the things that I needed to do. So I just think about that community, again, of church women, African-American church women, most of whom were domestic workers, who felt it was their business to support those of us who were receiving these great education or at these wonderful prestigious universities in Boston. But they were the shoulders we were standing on.
Absolutely. In the sense of you're sent out on a heroine's journey and a hero's journey in many ways, and with the notion that you're gonna do some good in a way that's not available to them. I think having that sense of support and hope is maybe something that our youngsters in the 21st century are missing, and that we could do a better job of making sure that they understand how much we believe in them and need them to live into their best self, you know, because sometimes what I hear a little bit too much of these days is critiques of the youth rather than a sense of they're my responsibility. My responsibility is to help them get where they need to go. They need to be invited upon my shoulders, not for criticism, but for support. And so I'm a very impatient person when people want to talk about kids too much. If you're trying to say too much negative stuff about children, you probably need to go on down the road to somebody else, because you're not going to like my response, because I feel a great responsibility that's more important than criticism. I mean, you know, they need to be told the truth, but they need to be told the truth with loving, compassionate kindness, and telling the truth in the with the understanding of I'm trying to help you get on to the next place. You need to put your foot down a little further to take your journey on down the road a little bit, and I'm trying to help you do that. And I'm going to tell you about what you're doing to mess yourself up, rather than you're messing yourself up and I don't like you and go away. You're making my world, I don't like what you're doing in my world. No, I don't like what you're doing to yourself. And I'm here to help you get on the right track. And that's what we had. That's what these women were about. That's what you just described, Cookie. That's what we had. That's what all of us are talking about here, is the people who had our best interest at heart and saw us as valuable contributors and some idea that we were going to have a future that was going to make the world bigger and better. How about that? Having people believe in you like that. It is an absolute gift. Absolute gift.
I think I'll go next.
Yes. Is it Tanja?
It's Tanja.
Tanja. Okay.
Yes, ma'am. I'm going to piggyback off of Koki. I had an aunt that bought a trunk for me when I was going off to college, and I still have that trunk. That was decades ago, and I still have that trunk. And I think about her when I don't go in the trunk that often, but when I think about the trunk, and I think of her and other things that make me think of her. But she bought me my first cassette player, and she saw in me something that I didn't see in myself, because I later went into broadcasting, and then when I was in college, there was another woman who I met her a couple of times, but she never really, I never really told her how much of an impact she had on my life, and that was Maya Angelou. And because I connected with her because of, I know you were born in Arkansas and I'm from Arkansas, and she lived a portion, an important portion of her life in Arkansas. And I was going through a rough time in college, and I met her while I was in college, and I read her book, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. And it just made such an impact, and that was a turning point in my life. That helped me to turn in the right direction.
That's wonderful. Where in Arkansas are you from?
Little Rock.
Oh, okay. The big city.
The big city. Well,
yeah.
yeah. So, but I thought I'd share that. And
thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Anyone else want to have your contribution in this conversation? Dr. Johnson, is your hand up or was, oh, okay. I couldn't tell what that was.
But I do want to give a shout out to the sister from Little Rock. I used to live there. I lived there for 14 years.
Oh.
And I'm originally from Arkansas.
Yeah.
Yes, I know that.
From where else did you live in Arkansas, Dr.
O-
Johnson?
Osceola, Arkansas, in Mississippi County, outside of Memphis, about 45 minutes
Yeah,
going west, not far
yeah.
from, yeah, that area.
I know where Osceola is because we lived in Morrow, and then we lived in Brinkley, and Forest City was not very far from us, and we weren't that far from Memphis and West Memphis. So it's and most of the time when I say I'm from Arkansas, people hardly know where the state is, let alone the city. It wasn't really as much of a city, it was a town. But it's kind of cool to meet people, to meet fellow Arkansans and Cookie's families from Ashdown, Arkansas. So yeah, yeah. Anyone else before we move along here? I don't want to short circuit anybody's to talk about your cloud of witnesses. I hope that if you haven't spoken and don't care to speak, that's fine. But I hope you are thinking about this, thinking about who these people are. I hope you are thinking about how you have given birth to new parts of yourself and how you might give birth to new parts of yourself. I don't think the rebirthing and birthing of ourselves is over ever until the last day we're on this planet. I think that's part of the joy of living, is to discover parts of yourself that you couldn't have known because you weren't there yet. You know, that people hold their breath against aging rather than seeing aging as a wonderful evolutionary process, a process of growing into new parts of yourself and discoveries that could not have been made. The things that I know now at 75, I could not have known at 45 because I wasn't there yet. And so to kind of stand begrudging your youth, you know, that you're growing. And we have such a silly relationship to aging in this country, you know, because the alternative is pretty bad. You're not going to get to stay the same. So you're either going to get older or you're going to die. So, I mean, take your pick. And I would take the aging instead of just going ahead and dying outright. I think, you know, let me stick around and see what else I can learn and watch myself. As a matter of fact, my kids laugh at me. They say, Mama, you're just so open to all this growing and being different. We expect to come home and find out you've bought a motorcycle. And I said, don't hold your breath. I'm not buying a motorcycle. But I am going to stay until the day I die, hopefully, curious and ready to see what else I can think and do that I didn't know before, and continuously to live in that idea that my mother had, that tomorrow's another day, and you don't know what that day is going to bring, and it's mostly going to bring something good, really. That's, you know, to have that that notion that tomorrow's going to bring something good, something better. I hate to hear people worried about tomorrow because they dread it or afraid of it, or don't want to take a chance that tomorrow might have been a better day than today or yesterday. So rather than kind of wanting to hold on, because there's no moment to live but the present one anyway, you know, and so trying to hold on to yesterday is just such a waste of time and energy. Because do you know anybody that's been able to do it? How would you do that? You know, it causes you to have to get stuck and not live into the great giftedness that comes. So anybody else want to talk about your cloud of witnesses, or times that you've been pushed a little further down the road than you thought you could ever go? Well, let me switch gears and ask if you have any questions. You know, I wanted to make sure that folks were able to feel like you could, that you were part of this conversation, and that I wasn't just coming to do another whole talk, but you had to hear about my women here first. So I've hoped there was enough of an opportunity for you to engage in conversation, for you to feel included. But I do wonder if you have any questions.
So Dr. Meeks, I know that your mom was really a resilient woman because you've spoken of her so many times in open forums, etc. Can you talk a little bit, or do you feel comfortable talking about the death of your brother and what that, the impact that had on your family?
Yeah. Part of the reason that I'm the person that I am is because I grew up in a household where my father suffered from post-traumatic stress syndrome. And the reason why my father had that problem was because he had to witness the death of my 12-year-old brother who could not get medical care when he was ill. So we lived, I told you, in Junction City, Arkansas, which was a little town. And my father he took my brother was complaining of his stomach over and over and over and hurting. And you know, country folks think they can fix everything with laxatives. So they tried that and it didn't work. And so then it got bad enough that daddy took him into El Dorado, and there's a hospital there called the Warner Brown Hospital. And when they took him there, they said, "Oh, you have to go to the charity hospital," because my father was poor, and we were poor and Black, and they didn't see Black people, but they didn't see poor people either. So they told him to go to Shreveport. Shreveport, Louisiana is 75 miles from us, and we didn't have a car. So daddy had to come back and find somebody with a car that he could get to drive 75 miles to take my brother to that hospital. And it took a while because people aren't just sitting around ready to go 75 miles, you know, because almost all the folks are poor back in those times. But they finally did find somebody, and he took him to the hospital in Shreveport. But it was just too late when they got there. My brother had a ruptured appendix, and he had peritonitis, and he died, and he was 12. His name was Garland. My father never recovered from his death, never. And my mother was a person who was able to always take whatever bad thing that was happening and just not allow it to immobilize her. Like my father became immobilized, I think, about this more than my father suffered differently from my mother because of this lack, because of racism, because of poverty. My father died when he was 70 from a stroke. And I watched, he was illiterate. He could not read or write. And I watched him every year. He was a sharecropper, and he thought that every year he'd get ahead. This year, the crop is good, so at the end of this, we'll have money. But there's never any money in the sharecropping construct because the people who own the land make sure that they charge you for everything so they get all the money back, so you don't end up with anything. So when I wrote my autobiography, I talked about sharecropping as glorified slavery, because that's all it is, actually. And so I watched my father live with post-traumatic stress and the being enslaved by sharecropping. And at 70 years old, he just couldn't take it anymore. So he had a stroke and died. However, my mother went through all of those things and came out on the other end in a much different way, because she was the person I've been talking about, because she just kept standing up. It was, you know, when I wrote my dissertation, I wrote about, I talked about the energy. I used the Greek goddesses as a model to talk about Black women. And of course, I had to fight with folks in my graduate school because their racism made them think that I couldn't use the Greek goddesses to talk about Black folks. And I had to set them straight and say, you know, Black folks are part of the whole construct of the universe. And so if you can talk about the Greek people this way, you can talk about Africans this way too, because the energy is universal and isn't bound by these stupid constructs we've made. So they finally let me alone, and I wrote my dissertation and got my PhD from Emory. And by the way, when my mother saw my PhD, I gave it to her just to look at, and she said to me, "You really did have to know a lot of words, didn't you, to write this?" You know, so yeah, but knowing a lot of words was not the half of it. But that was not, it was for her an amazing feat that I could fill up that many pages with words. So, but she, you know, always just found a way to get back up off the ground. I watched her go through many different kinds of things, and she just kept getting up. So there's somebody wrote a book about us having Black people, particularly women, being in the habit of surviving. That my mother was in the habit of surviving, and no matter what happened, you know, my younger brother was who died was a victim of this indefensible system of white supremacy and the poverty and all the other stuff that comes with it. And so it made me this person who was determined that wasn't going to be my story. I was determined that I was going to be an empowered human being that was not at the mercy of this kind of merciless system. And I think my mother was determined about that too. She never said it. You know, she never said a word about any of this stuff. She always thought that I was probably going to get arrested or killed because I had a big mouth about things. And when I was a kid, I would refuse to sit down in the doctor's office because it was segregated. That was my little way of being a protester, of not being a resistor. But my mother, bless her heart, when she moved to Los Angeles, I didn't tell you, they fired her, and she was a teacher, and I told you that. They fired her and all the Black teachers at the little school in Wheatley, Arkansas, when it was integrated. And those teachers sued the school district, and they won their lawsuit. Now, my mother would never have thought of herself as probably doing that. But like I said, she did the next thing, and the next thing was to do that. And so she did it. And then after they got some notoriety, she got recruited to teach in Bakersfield, California. But I didn't want to live in California, so I moved back to the South, which was a shock to me, because when I left Arkansas, I said I wasn't ever coming back to the South again. And then I ended up moving to Georgia. So, you know, like, you should be careful what you say. But every time I would call my mama from Macon, the first thing out of her mouth, she never asked me how I was. She'd always ask me, where was I? You know, and I said, why are you doing that? She said, well, I'm just always not sure if you're going to get arrested or something. And I wasn't doing anything. I don't know. But you know, your mama always knows who you are. And she knew this radical resistor that wasn't going to have it. But also, I'm practical. So I'm not going to go around throwing Molotov cocktails in the office building if I need a job. I'm going to go in the building and work, and I will make a different kind of Molotov cocktail. I mean, you have to be, you know, you have to learn how to be a resistor and survive at the same time. But we didn't ever talk about this stuff. So mama didn't know that I was this practical person. She just thought I was down here in the South, and, you know, I was in things were happening that I was not used to happening, like people not renting me an apartment, or back then in the early 70s, you know, people were still more open with their racism than they are now, though it's still going on in full force. But so she always thought, because she had this understanding of the resistor energy that I had, that I didn't know she even knew about, but that was what was worrying her. And now that I have children, I understand that better. I mean, I didn't understand it at all then, but I understand it now, and understand how you have this sense about who your kids are and how you want to protect them. I think she did want to protect us, and she did the best she could with that. she did the best she could about everything. And it's, you know, my father, I think my father is very proud that his, though he couldn't read or write, he was always committed to us learning how to read and write, and always supportive of that. Never did he discourage us from trying to read or write. And he would let me sit on his lap and read to him when I was a little kid. But you can't have better encouragement than that. Even though he didn't know what I was reading, he listened. And I don't know that I didn't know. I don't know that I knew when I was real little that he couldn't read. I did know he couldn't write, because he'd take me with him to sign his name, and he'd make an X, and then I had to write his name. So I discovered that he couldn't write, but it was a long time before I knew he couldn't read. And since he was listening to me read, I thought he could. But you know, you are the parent of the woman who has 3 degrees. So hopefully on some level, he knows that already. And if he doesn't, hopefully someday I'll get to tell him, because he contributed to me being this person, and my mother contributed to me being this person, and all of that great cloud of witnesses of folks who, some of whom didn't even know me, but they live their lives in ways that contributes to who I am, who we all are. And here we are, this community of people that have spent this time together since for the last hour and a half. And I hope that being here has given us just a little courage to be like a half a shade braver, just a half a shade braver. Every day we have to wake up and be a half a shade braver, says my poet friend, David White. You know, I'm always using that line because I love it so much. And the other day I was saying to myself, the way things are going in this country, I'm going to have to get a little more than a half a shade braver. You know, I think yesterday we just passed a law in Georgia to make it illegal for people to give folks water if they're standing in the line to vote. So, you know, when you live in a world where somebody wants to vote on something like that, you need to be more than a half a shade braver. Because what is going on in the mind of a human being that would even come up with such an idea? You want people to stand, in Georgia it's hot, you know, when we're voting in June, and even in November it's sometimes hot. And I'm sure that we've got enough ingenuity that we'll find a way around it. You know, people will just have big bottles of water in the parking lot, of big cases of water in the parking lot or wherever, and folks will be able to get water. But for somebody to come up with that idea really is discouraging. It's so petty until it makes you want to cry. It's so frightening that somebody would be mean enough to want to come up with that and to do that, to strike that kind of blow against the democratic process. So, but here these women are. Here's Ida B. Wells telling me, girl, that's not a big deal. You should have been around in the 1800s. You know, that's not a big deal. That's not a big deal at all. So all I say is to those folks is, you think you're gonna do something about voting? We're gonna register another 500,000 people. We're gonna be like an ant colony. You know, when you kill an ant, about 1 million of them come to the funeral. You know, so that's gonna be us. We're gonna, these people don't know what they have done. They don't know what they have done. And we're not gonna have them. We're not gonna have this in our world. We're going to deal with them. So all these folks that they think they're going to keep from voting, it's not going to happen. And there's a whole bunch more that didn't vote, and we're going to see to it that they vote, because that is the legacy. That is the legacy. And you notice, if you paid attention in Georgia, that a lot of the folks that have been leading this amazing resistance against this voter stuff have been African-American women. I don't know if you've noticed, but who have gone all the way back to get to those traditions that I've just been talking about. And those women are saying, we can't have this, and we're not going to. I thank you so much for your listening ears and listening heart. I thank you so much for your engagement in this conversation. And I pray that this hour and a half has been meaningful and that you will be able to be a half a shade braver every time you need to be. Thank you, Dr. Jody Allen, for inviting me, and Sarah for being such a good helper, and all of you for coming to participate and giving me the opportunity to talk about these women that I love so much and just could talk about forever, and love it when somebody wants to listen to me talk about them. So many blessings to all of you, and take good care.
Thank you.